The van door slammed shut. Through the glass, I saw my mother, Michelle, and my uncle Raymond laughing as they drove away, leaving 11-year-old me stranded in the suffocating heat of the woods. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just calculated the distance to the nearest highway. Before I reveal how I took everything back from the people who left me for dead, drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever been betrayed by the people who were supposed to protect you? I read every one of your stories. Fast forward 15 years. The woods were a distant memory, replaced by the glass and steel of the Aegis Dynamics headquarters. I sat at my mahogany desk, staring at the email that had just arrived. It was from my mother. She wasn't writing to ask how I was doing. She was writing to demand I fund a luxury family retreat in the Maldives for her, Raymond, and my siblings, Tiffany and Austin. It wasn't a request. It was an invoice for my continued existence in their orbit. For years, people looking from the outside might have wondered why I stayed connected to them at all. They might have thought my silence was weakness, a lingering desperation for their approval, but they didn't understand the invisible chain of the survivor. When you are raised in a prison without iron bars, your compliance is a survival mechanism, a form of learned helplessness. You don't stay quiet because you are weak. You stay quiet because you are calculating the exact moment it is safe to break the chains. I had spent 15 years building an empire from the dirt they left me in. I had also spent those years acting as the silent investor in their version of family. I paid their debts, funded my siblings' lifestyles, and allowed them to believe they still held the power. But love had merely been a subscription, and I had been footing the bill. I had spent the last 8 months mapping every dollar they siphoned, tracking every asset they acquired using my name as collateral. They thought I was their bottomless teller machine, but I was their auditor. The email from Michelle detailed the flights, the private villas, the champagne packages, a total of $85,000. I didn't reply to tell her no. You do not negotiate with bad investments. You liquidate them. Now, reading my mother's demand for a tropical vacation, anger wasn't loud. It was clinical. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. I picked up my phone and pressed a single button to connect to my executive team. I didn't hesitate. I didn't ask why my family was doing this. I simply gave the order, freeze all corporate credit lines associated with the family accounts immediately. Since they had leveraged their personal luxury expenses against the corporate credit lines, I had legally tethered to the family firm's assets, which I now held as the primary lien holder. They were effectively trapped in my financial architecture. Initiate the seizure protocols on the estate and the secondary properties. The silent audit I had been conducting was complete, and it was time to collect. I felt no panic, no despair, only the icy clarity of a transaction coming to its natural conclusion. They had spent 15 years treating my life as a joke. They weren't shocked by their own cruelty. They were going to be shocked that I had stopped playing along. By 12:03 in the afternoon, the accounts were locked. The Maldives trip was canceled. The financial oxygen they had grown so accustomed to breathing was cut off. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon even a fraction of regret for what I was about to do to them, but there was only precision. The retaliation had begun, and it was entirely unemotional. I closed my laptop and looked out over the city skyline. To understand the execution of my judgment, you have to understand the invisible years. You have to understand the architecture of sacrifice that built my family's comfortable lives. When I was 18, I sat at our kitchen table surrounded by college brochures, calculating how many shifts I needed to work at the diner to afford community college tuition. Across the room, my mother and Uncle Raymond were reviewing the final details of a brand new car purchase for my sister, Tiffany. Tiffany, who had never worked a day in her life. Tiffany, who was attending a private university fully funded by the money my mother claimed they didn't have. I remember asking my mother just once if there was any money left in the college fund for me. She hadn't yelled. She had simply sighed, a sound of profound inconvenience, and told me that tough love was the only way to build character. She convinced me, and perhaps herself, that my struggle was a necessary lesson. That is the true danger of toxic environments. It is the trap of cruel normalization. Abusers do not wake up every morning deciding to be villains. Instead, they build psychological frameworks to justify their cruelty, convincing themselves that their exploitation of you is actually for your own good. They normalize the cruelty until the abnormal becomes the daily routine, until stripping you of resources is framed as teaching you independence. I had internalized that lesson perfectly, though not in the way they intended. I realized then that my family did not view me as a daughter or a niece. They viewed me as a utility. I was the reliable machinery in the background, expected to run smoothly and silently while all the maintenance and care was directed toward Tiffany and Austin. Affection was not a right in our household. It was a commodity, and I was perpetually bankrupt. I paid every cent of my own tuition. I bought my own textbooks. I built Aegis Dynamics from a single laptop in a cramped studio apartment while they took vacations to Europe. I didn't resent the hard work, but I logged every discrepancy in the family ledger. I watched them congratulate themselves on Tiffany's mediocre milestones while ignoring my expanding corporate footprint. I watched them slowly transition from ignoring my existence to demanding the fruits of my labor. Once Aegis Dynamics became profitable, suddenly they remembered they had another family member. Suddenly, I was expected to fund the lifestyle they had always believed they deserved. They had spent years normalizing my deprivation, and now they were attempting to normalize my exploitation. But they had made a critical miscalculation in their accounting. They forgot that the person who builds the infrastructure is the only one who knows how to tear it down. They thought their gaslighting had worked. They thought I believed their narrative that family must always support family, regardless of the past. But I had stopped viewing them as family the day I realized I was entirely on my own. My independence was not a byproduct of their tough love. It was a weapon forged in the fires of their neglect. And I was finally ready to use it. It took exactly 3 hours for the reality of their frozen accounts to set in. My phone began to vibrate with a relentless urgency. First came the messages from Michelle, filled with confusion and typographical errors. Then came the calls from Raymond, escalating from patronizing demands to outright hostility. I ignored them all, letting the panic simmer. By late afternoon, they realized I wasn't going to fold, and the predators began to circle. They didn't come to my office. They knew security wouldn't let them past the lobby. Instead, they took their campaign to the public square. Tiffany posted a tearful video on social media, looking perfectly disheveled, crying about how success had turned her sister into a monster. Michelle and Raymond immediately shared it, adding long paragraphs about how I had abandoned the family that raised me. They called me ungrateful. They claimed I was hoarding wealth while the people who supposedly sacrificed everything for me were struggling. They even threatened my reputation at the family's legacy firm, a small, outdated logistics company that Raymond managed into the ground. Raymond sent a voice message declaring he would speak to my corporate partners, that he would expose me as a ruthless, disloyal fraud. He threatened to ruin Aegis Dynamics' upcoming public launch. It was a fascinating display of delusion. They were operating under the assumption that we were still playing by the old rules, the rules where their disapproval held weight, where the threat of public shame would force me back into submission. They thought they were backing me into a corner. They failed to realize I owned the entire building. I didn't issue a statement. I didn't defend myself in the comments section. Publicly arguing with them would only legitimize their narrative. Instead, I leaned back in my chair and watched the metrics. Every share, every outraged comment from their network was just free publicity for the Aegis Dynamics launch gala. They were doing my marketing for me. Let them scream. Let them play the victim. Their public meltdown was a symptom of their sudden, absolute powerlessness. They were thrashing against the invisible boundaries I had just erected. My legal team sent me a brief update confirming that the asset seizure was complete. The family firm Raymond was so proud of threatening me with was currently running on servers I owned, operating out of a building I had quietly purchased the debt for 6 months prior. Their social media campaign was the desperate flailing of a sinking ship. They thought they could intimidate me with words, completely blind to the fact that I had already dismantled their entire financial reality with a few keystrokes. Anger is a predictable emotion, sloppy and loud. Cold reason, however, is silent and absolute. I closed the social media tabs and turned my attention back to the launch gala preparations. I authorized their VIP passes specifically to lure them into a controlled environment where the process servers could legally and indisputably perform their duties. I wanted them front and center. I wanted them to walk into that room believing they were going to force a public confrontation, believing they could use the press to leverage my compliance. They had mistaken my silence for fear, just as they had mistaken my childhood survival for weakness. The accounting was almost complete. The next morning, I met with my lead attorney, Marcus, in the secure boardroom of my office. The social media noise was irrelevant background static compared to the documents he laid out on the gleaming glass table. This was the lethal discovery, the moment the narrative shifted from a simple family grievance into a criminal prosecution. Marcus slid a thick folder toward me. His expression was grim, professional, devoid of any pity. That was why I hired him. "We found a secondary issue during the final intellectual property sweep for the gala," Marcus said, his voice flat. "Your Uncle Raymond and your mother didn't just plan a smear campaign. They attempted a hostile acquisition. They didn't just stumble upon my work. They exploited a loophole in the NDA I had mistakenly signed with a legacy software contractor years ago. A contractor Raymond had secretly bribed to leak my early R&D files. I opened the folder. Inside were patent applications filed 3 weeks ago under the shell company associated with Raymond's logistics firm. They had attempted to file a fraudulent patent for the core security architecture of the Aegis Dynamics software. They had somehow acquired an early iteration of my source code and were trying to claim ownership of the very product I was about to launch globally. It was a breathtaking escalation. This was no longer just about exploiting my bank accounts for vacations or demanding tuition money. This was theft. This double twist elevated their cruelty into a severe ethical and criminal violation, cementing the necessity of my retaliation. They weren't just bad parents and siblings, they were corporate criminals. They believed that because I had built the software under their roof during my early college years, I owed them a legal claim to my intellectual property. They wanted to steal my life's work and force me to license my own creation from them. I didn't gasp. I didn't show shock. I simply analyzed the documents with the cold precision of a forensic auditor. "They missed something," I stated, tapping the second page of the filing. Marcus nodded. "They filed the patent based on the alpha build. They don't have the primary encryption key." I smiled, a tight, humorless expression. When I designed the Aegis architecture, I embedded a dynamic encryption sequence deep within the core code. I had been working with the court clerks and private investigators for weeks, filing the groundwork for this exact moment to ensure the legal hammer would fall precisely when they were most exposed. "Draft the injunction," I instructed Marcus. "We are going to invalidate their claim, but we won't serve them quietly. I want the fraud charges filed and the subpoenas ready for delivery tomorrow night." At the gala, Marcus gathered the papers, a glint of professional satisfaction in his eyes. It transforms a civil family dispute into a criminal prosecution for fraud. They are looking at severe penalties, and given the documentation, there will be no way to dismiss it. "That is not my concern," I replied, my voice steady. "They wanted to claim ownership of my work. Now they can claim ownership of the consequences. Prepare the kill shot, Marcus." The paperwork was finalized. The legal machinery was locked into place. My family thought they were playing a game of chess, but I owned the board, and checkmate was scheduled for tomorrow evening. The Aegis Dynamics launch gala was a masterclass in controlled spectacle. The grand ballroom of the convention center was bathed in sleek blue lighting, humming with the conversation of industry leaders, investors, and national press. I stood on the upper balcony, watching the floor below. Exactly on time, my family arrived. Michelle, Raymond, Tiffany, and Austin marched through the double doors, dressed in evening wear I had unknowingly paid for months ago. They moved with a desperate, aggressive energy, scanning the room, clearly intending to ambush me in front of the cameras. They wanted a spectacle. They wanted to force my compliance through public embarrassment. I descended the sweeping staircase, my silver gown catching the flash of cameras. I walked right past them. I didn't make eye contact. I didn't flinch when Raymond called my name. I stepped up to the podium, tapping the microphone, and the ballroom fell into a hushed silence. "Welcome to the future of global digital security," I began, my voice projecting across the vast room. I spoke about innovation, about resilience, and about building impenetrable systems. I unveiled the Aegis software, demonstrating the exact encryption architecture my family had tried to steal. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Raymond's face drain of color as the technical specifications flashed across the massive screens behind me. He recognized the code, he recognized the watermark, I had tracked their GPS-enabled event passes, ensuring my team knew their precise location the moment they crossed the ballroom threshold. At that exact moment, four individuals in sharp suits approached my family's table. They were not waiters. My security team had already signaled the floor staff to stand down. They knew exactly who those men were and why they were there, ensuring no interruption to the sequence. They were process servers. As the crowd applauded my presentation, the servers handed thick legal envelopes to Michelle, Raymond, Tiffany, and Austin. The flashing cameras of the tech press inadvertently captured the exact second their financial and legal doom was delivered. The envelopes contained the asset seizure confirmations, the frozen account notices, and the federal fraud indictments for the stolen patent. It was absolute, unmitigated ruin served on a silver platter. As I stood at the podium, watching their carefully constructed reality collapse, I realized the true nature of this moment. This was the justice of the seed sower. True justice is not merely about punishing the wicked for the past. It is about securing the future and rendering their cruelty entirely insignificant. My retaliation was not a destructive act. It was a creative one. I had built a legacy that they could never touch, making their betrayal look small, petty, and utterly meaningless in the shadow of my success. They stood frozen, holding the documents that outlined their criminal fraud charges and their complete bankruptcy. There was no screaming. The shock was too absolute. They had come to the gala expecting to force a negotiation. Instead, they were publicly handed their own eviction notices from my life. I concluded my speech to a standing ovation. I didn't look back at their table as I stepped off the stage and disappeared into the crowd of investors. I had executed the power reversal with surgical precision. They were no longer my terrifying abusers. They were simply defendants in a federal fraud case. I walked away, leaving them to navigate the ashes of the empire they thought they controlled. The fallout was swift and absolute. Within 30 days, the family estate was quietly liquidated to cover the mounting legal fees from their federal fraud defense. Raymond's logistics company, already drowning in debt and entirely reliant on my stolen infrastructure, was dismantled and sold for scrap. Michelle, stripped of the luxury she had weaponized against me for decades, was forced to move into a cramped rental apartment on the outskirts of the city with Tiffany and Austin. Both of my siblings, who had never lifted a finger, were now drowning in job applications, facing the brutal rejection of the entry-level market and realizing that no one cared about their last name. They were facing potential prison time for the intellectual property theft, but more immediately, they were facing the terrifying reality of a world where I was no longer there to subsidize their existence. I received updates about their struggles through brief memorandums from my legal team, reading the reports with the exact same emotional detachment I reserved for analyzing quarterly earnings. There was no manic joy in their suffering, no wicked thrill in watching them spiral into the ruin they had so carefully designed for themselves. There was only the quiet, profound stillness of a definitively closed account. I didn't revel in their destruction. I simply existed, finally, in my own absolute autonomy. The Aegis Dynamics launch was a massive global success, securing multi-million-dollar contracts with international financial institutions. I spent my days building my company, cultivating a circle of dedicated colleagues and mentors who valued my intellect, not the capital they could extract from my bank account. The suffocating heat of the woods where they had abandoned me 15 years ago felt like a lifetime away. I had walked out of those trees, built an impenetrable fortress, and permanently locked the gates behind me. As the dust settled and the noise of their legal battles faded into the background static of my life, the true weight of the journey finally registered. I've come to realize that walking away from your family is one of the most agonizing decisions a person can ever make. Society dictates that blood is an unbreakable bond, that we must endure endlessly in the name of kinship. But I've learned that letting go of blood ties to find yourself is sometimes the only legitimate path to survival. You are not obligated to set yourself on fire to keep your abusers warm, even if they share your last name. Cutting a toxic tie is not an act of malice. It is a necessary, brave act of self-preservation, a declaration that your peace is worth far more than their comfort. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free. I forgave them, not by welcoming them back into my life, but by completely releasing the hold they had over my future. I stopped carrying the anger, leaving it behind in the ashes of their own making, and walked forward into a life that is entirely, beautifully mine. I no longer look back at that stranded 11-year-old girl with pity. I look back at her with immense gratitude because her cold calculations saved us both. She mapped the distance to the highway, and I mapped the distance to freedom. We made it. This was my journey from the woods to the top of the world. If this story gave you the courage to set a boundary you've been scared to set, share this video. You never know who might need this reminder today. Thanks for standing with me.